The sound of rain hitting the pavement echoed through the empty streets of the city as Johnson, a 34-year-old man with a worn but resilient face, made his way home. His coat, frayed at the edges, flapped against his legs with each step. He worked as a mechanic at a local garage, his hands calloused from years of labor, but despite the hard work, he never seemed to get ahead. His life was filled with small victories, fixing an engine, solving a problem, and knowing that he had put in his best. But it was always followed by an even bigger loss, late bills, missed opportunities, and the feeling that no matter how much he tried, the world was just too heavy on his shoulders. At home, the apartment was a modest one, cracks on the walls, a flickering light in the hallway, and a kitchen that barely had enough space for a stove and a sink. It was here that Johnson had spent most of his life with Abby, the woman he had loved for as long as he could remember. Their love had been built on struggles and shared dreams, but life had slowly worn them down. Abby, also 34, had been his anchor. She was bright, beautiful, and had an energy that could light up even the darkest corners of their apartment. But lately, things had changed. Her patience had worn thin, and the dreams they had built together now seemed like a distant memory. She had begun to resent the monotony of their life, her hopes of a better future slowly slipping away as the months turned into years of financial hardship. Abby had always dreamed of something more, something bigger than the narrow, suffocating life she was living with Johnson. She had worked as a waitress at a high-end restaurant in the city, serving wealthy patrons who seemed to live in a different world. The world she longed to be a part of. And then, one evening, she met Greg. Greg, 35, was everything that Johnson wasn't: rich, confident, and exuding an air of superiority that made him impossible to ignore. He was a businessman with a silver tongue, capable of convincing anyone that he held the keys to a prosperous future. His wealth was obvious in the way he dressed, the car he drove, and the way he effortlessly navigated the circles of the elite. Abby had been drawn to him like a moth to a flame. At first, it was just a casual conversation after her shift, but as they exchanged words, something inside her shifted. Greg saw something in her that no one else had: the potential for a better life, a life that she could only dream of. He offered her what she had been missing: luxury, security, and the promise of a future without struggle. Johnson didn't know about the late-night calls, the dinners she had with Greg, or the way her eyes had begun to look at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. By the time he found out, it was too late. Abby had made up her mind. She had left, packed her bags, and walked out of their shared life, leaving Johnson to pick up the pieces of a broken heart. She moved in with Greg, leaving behind a life she had once cherished in exchange for a world of privilege. She justified it to herself by telling herself that she deserved better, that her dreams of a better life had always been just out of reach, and now they were within her grasp. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Greg pampered her with expensive gifts, took her to luxurious vacations, and made her feel like she was finally living the life she had always wanted. But as the months went on, Abby started to notice cracks in the facade. Greg's business was struggling, the lavish lifestyle they had grown accustomed to was beginning to slip away, and the reality of their situation was starting to rear its ugly head. Greg, for all his charm, wasn't the man he appeared to be. He was hiding secrets, and his arrogance had blinded him to the reality that his empire was on the verge of collapse. He had gambled with his investments, taken risks that hadn't paid off, and now the pressure was mounting. Abby began to feel the weight of their situation, the tension between them growing as Greg's frustration turned into cold indifference. The man she had once seen as her ticket to a life of luxury was now a shadow of the person he had been. But the worst part for Abby was the guilt. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had abandoned Johnson, her partner, her love, the man who had stood by her through every trial. She had convinced herself that she had made the right choice, that she was better off, but now the cracks in her new life were widening. And she couldn't ignore the whispers of doubt that began to creep into her mind. Meanwhile, Johnson had kept going. He worked harder, never letting the pain of losing Abby break him. He threw himself into his work, fixing cars, fixing his life piece by piece. But something inside him had changed. The loss of Abby, the woman he thought he would spend his life with, had ignited a fire in him. He wasn't just going to survive, he was going to thrive. And then, one day, things began to change for Johnson. It started with a simple job, a rich customer with a broken-down luxury car that had been to every other mechanic in town. No one had been able to fix it. But Johnson did. He spent hours working on it, using his knowledge and his skill, and when the car started up again, the owner of the car was so impressed, he offered Johnson a deal. The man was a businessman, and he saw something in Johnson, an untapped potential. He offered him a partnership, a chance to work in the luxury car industry, a world that Johnson had never even dreamed of. It was a huge leap, one that seemed almost too good to be true, but Johnson, with all his years of experience, saw an opportunity. The tides were beginning to turn. As Johnson found himself rising in his new career, Greg's fortunes took a turn for the worse. The collapse of his business was imminent. His wealth evaporated as quickly as it had come, and the lavish lifestyle he had promised Abby began to crumble. He became desperate, trying to cling to a world that was no longer within his reach. Abby, too, found herself caught in the chaos of Greg's downfall. The once glamorous life had become a distant memory as the bills piled up and the tension between them escalated. Greg, now a shell of the man he had once been, became bitter and angry, blaming everyone but himself for his fall from grace. Abby began to realize that the dream she had chased, the dream of luxury and security, had turned into a nightmare. She found herself questioning her choices. She had left Johnson for a life of opulence, but now, that life was slipping through her fingers and she had nothing left but regret. As Johnson's success grew, he found himself living a life that he had never imagined. He was finally in a position to help others, to give back in ways he never could before. But when Abby came back into his life, seeking help, seeking solace, he found himself at a crossroads. Or would he stand firm in his newfound strength, letting the past stay where it belonged, behind him? As the year passed, Abby's life was completely transformed. She had embraced the luxury that came with Greg's wealth, moving into a modern penthouse in the heart of the city, attending exclusive parties, and experiencing a life that she had once only dreamed of. Greg had proven to be a perfect match for her, charming, generous, and always ready to indulge her in every desire. But despite the lavishness, something felt missing. Abby tried to ignore the pangs of emptiness that began to grow inside her, but they were becoming undeniable. The things that once filled her life with joy, luxurious dinners, spa weekends, expensive trips, felt shallow in comparison to the quiet, thoughtful conversations she once shared with Johnson. Greg, though kind and doting, was consumed by his empire, constantly dealing with business matters and the ever-growing demands of his lifestyle. Abby felt isolated in a mansion full of people, her only companion being the personal assistants and staff who took care of every need she could possibly have. Meanwhile, Johnson's life was taking a completely different turn. After Abby left, he had been devastated. But in the solitude of his grief, something changed inside him. He focused all his energy into his work, learning new skills, honing his craft, and finally understanding the true value of perseverance. Slowly, he started climbing the ranks in his career, gradually becoming known for his innovative approach to business. At first, it seemed small. A better position here, a lucrative project there. But then, the opportunities started to snowball. Within a year, Johnson had successfully launched his own startup, creating a breakthrough product that caught the attention of the tech industry. His company, once a small operation, was now on the verge of a major acquisition by a global giant. What Abby didn't know was that Johnson's new venture was quickly propelling him into the very circle she had left behind. From his quiet, humble beginnings, he had worked his way to the top with grit and determination, something that Greg, despite all his wealth, had failed to do. The day Johnson received the call that his startup was being acquired for millions, he didn't celebrate, he reflected. He remembered the days when he would sit with Abby, talking about dreams they had together. He had spent so much time chasing success, but the true value of his life lay in those memories. Still, the past was the past, and the future was calling. A few months later, as if fate had decided to throw a twist in the plot, Greg's empire started to crumble. It began with a series of bad investments and a high-profile business deal that turned sour. Greg, once an unshakable force in the business world, now found himself drowning in debt. The bills piled up, the calls from creditors became frequent, and the media started turning their attention to his failed empire. Greg, who had once been on top of the world, was now faced with the harsh reality of financial ruin. Abby watched in disbelief as everything Greg had worked so hard for began to unravel. She couldn't believe how quickly the tables had turned. The expensive dinners, the trips to exclusive resorts, the endless designer shopping sprees, they all seemed so trivial now. Like fleeting distractions from the chaos that was slowly consuming her partner's world. One fateful evening, Greg called Abby into their penthouse living room. He looked different, tired, worn out, and broken. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by desperation. "I don't know how it all fell apart, Abby," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought I had it all under control. But now it's slipping through my fingers." Abby's heart sank. She had witnessed this before, in a different life, when Johnson had been struggling with his own demons. She thought about the countless times Johnson had talked to her about resilience and how he never gave up, no matter how dire the situation seemed. And now, here she was, faced with a man who had everything, yet lost it all. "I thought I had everything I ever wanted," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But sometimes it's not about having more. It's about having the right things." Greg looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice strained. Abby paused, looking out at the city lights that flickered below them, before answering. "It means maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I left something real behind." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't just Greg she was reflecting on, it was herself. In the search for a life of luxury and comfort, she had lost the connection she once had with the one person who truly understood her. Meanwhile, Johnson was re-entering her life, though he had no idea yet. As he prepared to meet with the investors who were buying his startup, he couldn't shake the thought of Abby. He remembered their last conversation, the final goodbye that had felt like the end of an era. But now, with his newfound wealth and success, he felt a strange sense of closure. He had proved to himself that he didn't need to rely on anyone else for validation. But still, there was a nagging feeling in his chest, a pull towards the past, to what he had once shared with Abby. The question of whether they could ever find their way back to each other lingered in his mind, especially as the world around him seemed to promise all the material success he had ever dreamed of. Would it be enough? That night, as Abby stared out at the skyline of the city, the weight of her choices became almost unbearable. She had chosen Greg's wealth over Johnson's authenticity. Now, it seemed that the roles had reversed. Was she ready to face the consequences of her actions? Would she be able to reconcile the two parts of her life that seemed so far apart? And as Johnson sat in his office, awaiting the finalization of his deal, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was an unfamiliar number calling his phone. He hesitated before answering. What could this call mean? "Hello," he asked. "Johnson." The voice on the other end was familiar. "Abby." "Johnson." Abby's voice came through the phone, tentative, almost fragile. "It's me. Abby." For a moment, he was frozen. The past, the heartbreak, the long-lost conversations, it all rushed back to him in a wave. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, not after everything that had happened. "Abby," he replied softly, his voice catching in his throat. "It's been a long time." A quiet pause hung between them before she spoke again. "I don't even know where to begin," she said. "I've been thinking about you. About us. Everything." Johnson felt a strange mix of emotions, surprise, nostalgia, and something he couldn't quite place. He knew this call wasn't just about catching up, it was something deeper, something that had been building up over time. Are you okay? He asked, a concern he hadn't felt in years creeping into his voice. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. Everything's falling apart, Johnson. I thought I had it all figured out. But now, I realize I lost sight of what really mattered. Johnson closed his eyes for a moment, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had been waiting for this, waiting for the chance to hear her admit that she had made a mistake. But it didn't feel like victory. Instead, it felt like the last remnants of something that had once been precious, something that might have slipped through his fingers as well. I never stopped thinking about you, Abby, he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But I've changed. I'm not the same person I was when we were together. I've built something for myself, and I'm not looking for a quick fix anymore. I can't just go back to the way things were. Abby's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this response. She had hoped, deep down, that things could be different, that somehow they could find their way back to each other. But she knew that Johnson wasn't the same person either. He had grown stronger, more independent, and more successful. His life wasn't waiting around for her to come back and fix it. I understand, she said softly, almost to herself. I don't expect things to be the same. I don't know what to do anymore. Greg's empire is crumbling, and I feel like I'm losing everything, including myself. The vulnerability in her voice cut through him. Despite the distance that had grown between them, despite the years that had passed, Johnson still cared deeply for her. He remembered the Abby he had fallen for, the woman who dreamed of a future, who laughed at the little things, and who made him believe that there was more to life than just success. Maybe you don't need to have everything figured out right now, Johnson said, his voice calm but with a quiet strength. Maybe you need to give yourself some space to breathe, to find out who you really are, apart from all of this. Abby let out a shaky breath, her mind spinning. I don't know if I can do that, she whispered. I've spent so long chasing something I thought would make me happy. And now that I have it, I realize I'm still empty inside. Johnson understood the pain in her voice all too well. He had felt it too, how success and material wealth couldn't fill the spaces inside him that craved something deeper, something real. I can't promise you anything, Abby, he said gently, his words firm. But if you want to find your way back to yourself, I think the first step is letting go of everything that's not really yours. And that includes the fantasy of what you thought life would be like. She didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said over the years. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can let go of all of it. But maybe I need to try. For the first time in years, Johnson felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't about them getting back together, or about fixing the past. It was about Abby taking the first step toward reclaiming herself. And in that moment, he realized that he had already done the same for himself. I'm here if you need to talk, he said quietly. But take your time. Don't rush. As the conversation ended, Abby sat in the dimly lit penthouse, looking out at the city. The glow of the city lights reflected in her eyes, but something had changed. She didn't know what the future held or if she and Johnson would ever reconnect, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She had been chasing something that was never hers to begin with, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. Meanwhile, Johnson hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He had no illusions about what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for sure, he was on his own path now, and whether or not Abby joined him on it, he was finally at peace with himself. As the days passed, Abby faced the storm that was her life with new clarity. The crumbling empire, the shattered expectations, they all became part of her journey. She started focusing on rebuilding, not just the material aspects of her life, but her sense of self. It was difficult, but with every small step, she could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. And Johnson? He continued building his business, growing in ways he hadn't imagined. But every now and then, he would think of Abby. He wondered if she had truly found the path that would lead her to peace, just as he had found his own. But for now, their paths were separate, each with its own purpose, and maybe, just maybe, that was how it was always meant to be. A year later, Johnson stood on top of a mountain, looking at the city that had once been his home. His life had changed beyond recognition. Instead of sitting in an office or trying to start something from scratch, he had become an entrepreneur. But he didn't get rich overnight. His business was small but strong, and he was at peace. Since the time he left Abby, he had learned an important truth: wealth isn't always about money. Below, he saw a cloud of cars moving along a major highway, and he felt part of something bigger. He didn't need a luxurious house or the madness of city life. He realized that true wealth is the ability to choose your life. Abby was on the other side of the city, feeling abandoned. With Greg, things were not what she had imagined. From the moment her well-being started to fade, she realized that she missed the real connection she had with Johnson. Wealth didn't bring her joy. She felt that something was missing in her life: simplicity, sincerity, warmth. Greg had not become the person she had hoped for. Among his new friends, luxurious restaurants, and parties, she began to feel like a stranger. She was changing, and sometimes it seemed like she didn't know who she truly was. Johnson had been a reminder of simplicity, not of glamour. He had been someone who understood her, supported her, without caring about her money or status. And, although she couldn't turn back time, she knew that now she had to move on, find her own path, and self-realization. There was no reconciliation between them, but perhaps this was the best ending for their story. They both found their own ways, despite everything that had happened. They wouldn't make up, wouldn't return to each other, but they would keep this important realization within them. True wealth isn't always measured by money, and sometimes the most valuable thing is to find your own path. And so, their paths diverged, but on this journey, each of them discovered themselves and began to live authentically.